Listeners, welcome to our Good Faith podcast presentation called Reading to Make Sense of the World. Here at Good Faith, we believe that great books are gifts from God. And one of their important benefits is they serve as compasses, helping us to make sense of the world around us. But there's so many books we could read, and let's face it, all of us have so little time. So how do we make the best use of our time to read the most helpful books? Fortunately, we have here a great source of expert guidance. I am so happy to be joined by Jessica Hooten Wilson, our friend, author, and chair of great books at Pepperdine University. In each presentation of Reading to Make Sense of the World, Jessica will guide us towards a book that she has carefully selected that is especially worth our time and for this moment in the world. Jessica, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Curtis. I loved getting to hear you introduce that. That is so exciting that you're doing this.
I am very excited also, and we're going to get started with what have you selected for us today, Jessica?
Flannery O'Connor. I mean, I think it could be expected based on how much I love her and adore her, but I chose her prayer journal for today.
Okay, well, let's just actually dive into it because I want to talk about this selection and Flannery O'Connor and why she's a particularly fitting guide for us this moment in the world. But why don't you give listeners a taste of Flannery O'Connor and read your excerpt?
Sure. So Flannery O'Connor, I would say, is like the most Christian writer from American history. And she's one of those writers that really shows us a new vocabulary for understanding God. And in this prayer journal, she's about 20 years old. She goes away from the South, which is her home, to Iowa Writers Workshop. And she's there and she's writing prayers for the first time. She's always been someone who kind of recited prayers. She grew up Catholic. And instead, she's trying to address God in a very personal way. It kind of almost sounds like a new faith, and yet it's rooted in this old tradition. And so the vocabulary there is just very rich and inspiring and encouraging.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. So the very first prayer that she prays, I'll just read an excerpt of it because I enjoy reading this. You know, when I give talks publicly or when I start class, I often start with this prayer. She says, "Dear God, I cannot love thee the way I want to. You are the slim crescent of a moon that I see, and myself is the earth's shadow that keeps me from seeing all the moon. The crescent is very beautiful, and perhaps that is all one like I am should or could see. But what I'm afraid of, dear God, is that my self-shadow will grow so large that it blocks the whole moon, and that I will judge myself by the shadow that is nothing. I do not know you, God, because I am in the way. Please help me to push myself aside."
Wow, that's a beautiful image. This idea that our self is like the earth blocking the shadow from blocking even ourselves are blocking our view of God as this moon. It evokes a lot of thoughts and feelings in me. What did it evoke in you such that you would even open some of your classes with this poem?
Yeah, it ends up being this kind of nightmare image for me.
Yeah.
It's really haunting. And yet I think all of us know what she means because I think we've all had moments like that. So when I think about it in terms of classes, I'm always thinking of my students. You know, they may walk in thinking, I'm just going to perform for the professor. I'm going to outdo my classmates, or I'm going to show how smart I am. And then it prevents learning, right? And so they don't get to see where God could reveal himself to them. Or when I do public speaking, I think about this prayer and I read it because I think, I am just a John the Baptist. I'm just trying to point to Jesus, point to Jesus. But when you're standing up there with a microphone, it's hard to remember, I'm pointed to Jesus, Lord, get me out of the way. Just push me aside so that they can see the moon. They can see your light.
You know, it strikes me for this particular moment, and I mean moment like in a grand sense of like our big cultural moment, it seems like the self is gigantic. The self is like a whole planet. And by that, I mean, everything revolves around the self. What makes me happy? What makes me sad? What satisfies me as consumers? The whole consumer economy is all predicated on satisfying and filling the self. And I feel like the self has gotten so large and engorged and big. It's like a planet in which we think everything revolves around us. And this poem is evoking this haunting image. We can get so big in our own self size, if you will, that it occupies so much of our vision, it actually blocks us from God.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Tell more how Flannery O'Connor is trying to wrestle with this, because she's writing way back even before now. So she's already
Mm-hmm.
experiencing in herself this enlargement of this self. How does she wrestle with bringing the self back down to a proper size so that we can see God, the moon, in that poetic
Yeah.
construction?
So a lot of times in Flannery O'Connor's writing, she's doing this with characters. So she tries to move them to the same places that she herself is trying to go as a writer, as a person.
Mm.
And she's very much thinking in terms of being God's typewriter, which she also says in the prayer journal, where she can write in such a way that people can also experience this transformation that God is doing in her life too, right? And so she wants to take characters where they move from this self-exaltation. So you'll see characters kind of standing and almost daring the sun with their poses. They'll stand straight and they've got their hands on their hips and they're looking at the sun, and it like represents Jesus. And it's like, I dare you to be brighter than me. I dare you to shine brighter than me. And they have to have this fall that kind of helps them descend and humble themselves in order to really see who God is. And she talks about the movement that she's making for characters to self-exploration is a moment of humbling in which they see the truth and judge themselves by it and not the other way around. That's directly from her writing.
Let's talk about how she describes that process of humbling, because one of the themes that seems to me of Flannery O'Connor is just that what's involved in that process.
Mm-hmm.
And I am not a Flannery O'Connor expert the way you are. In fact, I have to confess, I never read her before college.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read her, I think it was for a class taught by Robert Coles
wow.
at Harvard.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, but this is the embarrassing thing, Jessica, is in the seminar, I think I remember referring to Flannery O'Connor as a he and a him, because and when somebody said, that's a she, I was like, I think that was my embarrassing, humbling moment that she's actually trying to write about. I experienced by actually talking about her writing, but in this really awkward, clumsy, and ignorant way.
Mm-hmm.
But that moment of humbling, of recognizing, oh, I'm not as big, as smart, as well read, perhaps, as I thought I was. I experience how she does that it's not a gentle process. It's like a jarring, almost violent, like there's some really shocking passages in Flannery O'Connor. Can you connect the dots for that shocking, sometimes really even violent sort of passages and scenes, and this process of humbling? Because you don't normally think of those two as going together.
Well, you might actually, because humbling is humiliation. I mean, there's a lot. True. There's a very tight.
Yeah, it is like somebody telling you Flannery O'Connor is a she. So
yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it's a knocking off the horse that you were riding on, right? And realizing how small you are. And I think this is why a prayer journal is a really good segue for most people who haven't read Flannery or don't know her well, because there is such violence and there is such shock in her fiction. And if you take it from this perspective, if you read the prayer journal where she says things like, I want to suffer. Please, Lord, give me the grace to suffer. Or, Lord, give me the necessary grace, but don't let it be as hard to get as it was for Kafka. Or, these are some of the quotes from her prayer journal where she seems to really be struggling with this. Like, she's not trying to shock for the sake of shock. And you get her motivation that she wants to shock you because she believes that if you don't recognize your earthliness, your dirtness, if your face isn't in the sand, right? You don't realize your smallness, you're never going to know God's greatness. And so she's kind of doing this good deed of like, I've got to knock you down to the ground, just because I had to also be knocked down to the ground. And in the prayer journals, we get those moments where we get to see how small she is and how big then God is. One moment she says, Lord, let me know my place. If it's to wash the second step every day, let me know it and love it, and let my heart overflow with love, just washing that second step, right? Or, Lord, I'm a cheese. Make me a mystic immediately. And you can do that, God. You can make cheeses into mystics. And so there's this beautiful, like these images that remind us of her humility, maybe that don't feel so violent, but feel very true, in the same way that the violence in her stories are supposed to bring us to that truth.
One of the things we've covered a lot in our podcast is talking about people who've gone through suffering and what they have learned and been transformed through that. I'm thinking about our episode with Amy Lowe, where she talked about facing cancer Nancy French and talking about her experience of sex abuse as a young girl, like really horrific stuff. And Flannery O'Connor covers some of this horrific stuff. It's really helpful to hear you describe why she's doing that in
Mm-hmm.
terms of that knocking down or confronting oneself with one's smallness before
Mm-hmm.
God. I get that.
Mm-hmm.
Does Flannery O'Connor help us come out of that on the
Yes.
other side?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is actually why people find her horrific. It's going to sound ironic, but let me get there.
Yeah.
I think the horror, and people always, Flannery said, they have hold of the wrong horror when they look at my work. The horror is not that bad things happen to good people. We all experience that and we know that. She's saying that even though bad things happen to good people, the Lord may redeem it. The Lord
Mm.
may use it. The Lord may make it an instrument, and it doesn't have to end with the suffering. It can be good. And the very fact that her fiction and her prayer journal points to that goodness is the thing that people cannot stand. Right?
Mm.
They can get that you would go down into the depths of despair and horror and stay there. That makes sense to the world. That it would lead you to nihilism, it would lead you to hate, it would lead you to violence. That's something that all people get, and they want her to write that. And instead she doesn't. She writes that you can actually go to your lowest point. The world can sexually assault you. Violent Bear It Away shows that.
Yeah.
The world can destroy you by sickness, which happened in her own life. And yet God can move it towards blessing somehow. He can take you out of the pit. And that's what people find. People find that horrific, right?
Well, it seems like, especially when you say people, I wonder if you mean sort of the avant-garde, trendy world of non-fiction literature. Because
Yeah.
honestly, this is where modern novels I find so hard to deal with, because they want to take you there
Mhm.
and they kind of want to leave you there in that place of
Yeah.
darkness and despair. And what you're saying, the kind of challenge that Flannery O'Connor brings is that, yeah, she'll go there, but
Mhm.
she's also going to take you out of there and say the
Yes.
story doesn't end there. So it strikes me, okay, so that's kind of the prophetic message to maybe the secular sort of modern novelist and the
Mhm.
novels that they write. It also strikes me that the challenge then to the deeply cultural Christian is that you actually have to go there. You do have to go
Yeah.
there and not just go straight to the uplifting part of it, which I think many, I would count myself included. I think this is
Yeah.
why I find sort of those novels hard, is because I'm like, oh, I don't want to feel bad.
Mhm.
Life's hard enough as it is. Like, I don't want to go there to a place of despair. It seems like what Flannery O'Connor, the vision she's holding out is, no, you actually have to go
Yeah.
there if you want to get to the true redemption of it. Is that
Yeah.
kind of one way to think about this?
Absolutely. I mean, if we think of the story of our God, it is the Thursday night praying until you're bleeding sweat, right?
Yeah.
Like it's tears and blood. And then Friday crucifixion, Saturday waiting and not knowing, and the pain of that or the difficulty of that. And then the Sunday resurrection. So there's an entire process before we get to say, yes, resurrection, and then ascension, and then Pentecost, and all those glorifying moments where God just gets to celebrate with us that he is alive, are very much preceded by trouble in the church and trouble in the life of Jesus.
It seems like many people can relate to Flannery O'Connor in terms of like your personal struggles and making sense of how you have to go through the darkness in your own personal life to get to that redemption. I'm also interested in how much of she functions as almost like a social critic or a guide to what is happening in the world outside of us, like in the world out there.
Mm-hmm.
How much does Flannery O'Connor, does her works have kind of a help for us to make sense of the darkness in the world, kind of just in events happening out there in the world as well?
Yeah, I think that the struggle with me for Flannery is that she's not trying to be a social critic. I mean, she would regularly say, I can't comment on things that were happening in the world, because she said, I knew my vocation, I knew my limits. And I think sometimes, especially artists, forget their limits. They want to address all the problems, all the things, instead of realizing like there is a frame to the canvas that is provided, that God provides for you, that limits what you can draw and what you can see. And to write outside of that, you're going to try to prophesy about things that you don't know. For Flannery, I think what's really helpful is that she would say, what's wrong with the world? She would answer like Dante or like Chesterton did, what's wrong with the world is me. And so by starting and saying like, what's wrong with the world is myself, that kind of humility we talked about at the beginning, that starts to change the world, right?
No,
Admitting
really
that is kind
profound.
of like a first step.
Right, right. So her guide in terms of if you're going to deal with something out there in the world, like you're really upset about whatever, some political party that
Hmm.
you think is
Yeah.
really the problem in the world. Flannery's invitation is, hey, actually start with the darkness inside us
Yes.
and actually deal with that before you go and sort of point the finger at this problem out there.
Absolutely. Yep.
So Jessica, let's give people some sort of guides on how to get started with Flannery O'Connor. Let's say you're listening to this and you're like, okay, that sounds like a really important process of this
Mm-hmm.
self-examination, of this humbling that leads to a clear vision of the moon, of the vision of God. How do people get started? You offered a starting point with the prayer journals. Would you
Mm-hmm.
recommend that people start there?
I think so. It's a devotional read. It's a beautiful entry point to getting to know her as an author. I think that she sometimes, unless you're going to have a teacher walking you through the stories, it's a difficult, jarring experience for some people. It wasn't for me. I mean, I read it at 15. I loved it. So it's not everybody that gets jarred by it. Some people will just really get magnetized by it. But others, we kind of need this almost like bridge on ramp
Mm,
to Flannery O'Connor. Her letters and her journals and her essays sometimes provide that. And it gives you enough context that when you get to read her stories, you see the power that's there and you don't miss it.
mm,
But I would recommend that anybody who starts with her stories, there's collections of her whole stories. You start in the back of the book, read the stories that she wrote towards the end of her life, going then forward. So Revelation, Parker's Back, Judgment Day, go that way in the narrative because she I think became better as a craftswoman. And I think she
mm.
became almost more gentle towards her reader, even though there is some like striking moments. And she's very comedic too. So you have to also realize it's humorous. Like you can laugh, and that's great that she wants you to. Like Chesterton says, the angels fell because of their gravitas. And if they would have just laughed more, they would have been able to stay in heaven.
Yeah.
So yeah, so please like enjoy her stories and laugh at them and enjoy them. I think she's trying to say it, Christian life should be about that too.
Okay, repeat again. So you're saying
Yeah,
start with the journals and the diary entries, which we'll provide show notes to. But then,
sure.
uh, yeah, what would what's the next? Where should they
Then
go after that?
grab her complete stories and start at the back of
Okay,
the book.
okay, sounds good. Jessica, this has been great. Thank you so much for providing us some guide into the works of Flannery O'Connor, who, as you said, is one of the great Christian novelists of our time and perhaps
Hmm.
all times. And what a wonderful entree you've given us. Thank you, Jessica.
Yes, thank you, Curtis. I hope people enjoy her.